Okay, hi, I'm Maris Kreisman, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event at McNally Jackson. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming up soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking about them now. You can put your questions in the Zoom chat and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've weathered the pandemic and reopened all 4 of our locations for browsing and shopping, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy An Ordinary Age from McNally Jackson. Esquire magazine says Rainesford Stauffer explores the diminishing returns of young adulthood in this soulful book, providing a meticulous cartography of how outer forces shape young people's inner lives. From chronic burnout to the loneliness epidemic to the strictures of social media, An Ordinary Age leads with empathy in exploring the myriad challenges facing young adults, while also advocating for a better path forward, one where young people can live authentic lives filled with love, community, and self-knowledge. So pleased to be joined by Rainesford and Ashley Ford to launch this wonderful book tonight. Rainesford Stauffer has written and reported for the New York Times, New York Magazine's The Cut, Wall Street Journal Magazine, Teen Vogue, Vox, and The Atlantic, among other outlets. She's appeared on CNN Newsroom, NPR's On Point and Weekend Edition, and podcasts such as ABC News's Start Here, The Guardian's Chips with Everything, and Foreign Policy's Don't Touch Your Face. She is a journalist, speaker, and a Kentuckian. And Ashley C. Ford is a writer, host, and educator who lives in Indianapolis, Indiana. Her memoir, Somebody's Daughter, will be published by Flatiron Books on June 1st, 2021. So I will also be putting a link in the chat to pre-order Ashley's book. And I'm so excited to turn it over to you both. Welcome.
Oh my gosh, this is gonna be so much fun. Rainesford, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me and for being here with me. And this is just such a surreal thing.
You've written a fantastic book.
Thank you. That
Truly,
means the world coming
truly.
from me, as you know. I'm a diehard fan.
Thank you. That's really, really, really nice. Like almost too nice, but I'm gonna take it because I need too nice these days.
It's true, I promise.
One of the ways that you describe young adulthood, or you describe your own young adulthood, is feeling like a lost emerging adult. And I kept thinking about that, like, because you said as a young person, a lost emerging adult. I kept thinking that is such a universal experience. That is so universal that as we get older, especially in our early 20s, we feel very lost. But it is also true that for some reason, we think everybody else has it together. Even though this is a universal experience, our parents experienced it, you know, maybe not the same way we have, but it is generationally, everybody has this problem. And yet we think everybody else has it together for some reason. Can you talk to me about why that is? How do we even begin to get the impression that we're the only one?
I think that is kind of the universal question, and because you're exactly right, it's the universal theme of this time of life. And while it definitely manifests differently now because the world is different now, our parents, our grandparents all had that moment of, oh God, what am I supposed to be doing? What's my purpose in life? Why does everybody have all of this figured out and know what they're doing and I'm the only one that doesn't? And so I think that what has happened, especially in the past couple of decades, is that as the markers of what it means to be an adult shift or change radically because of society, because of economics, because of all of these different social structures that are changing, or in a lot of cases, unfortunately not changing, we don't really have a a guidebook on what it means to successfully enter adulthood anymore. And that's something that previous generations kind of did have. Not everybody did it, but it was, moving out of your parents' house, it was getting married, it was entering a job you were going to stay in at least, for a little while. And now it's all kind of in flux. And I think one of the great things about that is that it's given people a lot more freedom in their choices. We're allowed to choose the path we want to take to a certain extent in life. And we know that not everybody has that option, and certainly not the options aren't all the same for everybody. But there's still this idea that we should be sticking to this trajectory that worked a couple decades ago. And so that's where the talking point comes from of like, well, why are all the young people so behind? What's wrong with the millennials? Is Gen Z going to be even more behind? It's not generational that young people are working to find their way and figure out their place in the world. The generational shift, and the reason we all feel like we're running behind, is that we're trying to match this timeline that was outdated and never worked for anyone anyway. And we still don't do a very good job talking about feeling behind. I feel like there's this pressure to know what you're doing, be composed, have it all together. And deep down, we know that none of us are, but I think talking about that out loud really contributes to the sense of like, it's just me out here, lost and wondering.
And yet, if we don't talk about these things out loud, if we don't have these conversations, as is displayed a few times in your book, we can lose people. The young people in your book have experienced loss of friends, loss of family members, loss of siblings, to things like suicide, addiction. Like it's just loss upon loss compounded, even as they are entering or dead in the middle of this phase in their lives. So I'm wondering, how do you think we should be talking to young people about loss? Because right now, especially in the global pandemic, a lot of loss is happening, not just the loss of people and relationships, but the loss of time, it seems like, for a lot of people. So how do we talk to people about that? How do we talk to young people about that in a way that like helps them process that?
God, I think that's such a tremendous question, because I don't think we talk about loss or grief or the many forms it can take. And a lot of young people I talk to, even when they had lost a parent or a friend, or the loss was tangible, it was a human being, they felt like there was no space to slow down and process that. I talked to a student a couple weeks ago, beyond the scope of the book, who had lost a parent to COVID, and in the same week broke up with their significant other. Life was just hard. And their professor sends this lovely message, with all this sympathy and comfort, and then reminds them that they have a final that's due in a couple weeks. And I think that anecdote sums up so much of our approach that we have to loss with anyone, but I think especially with young people, because there's this idea that you're young, you've got a bunch of time, life is going to work itself out, you need to bounce back, you need to keep going. And while, yeah, of course, we need to be resilient where we can in our lives, I think that part of resilience is acknowledging how loss impacts us. And to your point, not just loss of people, but loss of time, loss of circumstances, loss of a job, which we know can have a big domino effect on everything else in your life.
Yes.
And I think that the first thing we have to do is talk about it at all, because that was something that came up time and time again in conversations I was having, where people were like, there's nowhere in my life to bring this. It feels too heavy to talk to my friends about. I don't have a familial relationship to go to. My boss certainly isn't going to understand. So I think that what we have to keep in mind about loss when we talk to young people, especially in terms of working through it, is that it's not a matter of getting over it and moving on and going back to life as you knew it before whatever the loss was. Because for most of us, that's just probably not going to be the case. It's figuring out how to let yourself grieve, how to slow down enough where you can to let yourself process. And I think this might be an unpopular opinion, but allowing yourself to be shaped by that loss a little bit. I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that we've felt like we've kind of lost a year, because as behind as that's made a lot of us feel, I think that for those who are lucky enough to still be around, it's also been a clarifier of what am I going to do with my time on earth? What am I going to fight for? Who am I going to do it with? And I think that that can be a really important part of growing up, is figuring out, how do I let loss shape me and not work in opposition to it, but kind of let it in.
What was the last loss that shaped you?
Oh man, the last loss that shaped me, I think there have been a lot. I've lost jobs and have lost health insurance, and I think all of that shaped me. But a couple years ago, the person was also in their early 20s at the time. I lost a friend to a severe mental illness. And it was someone that had been a fixture in my life for almost as long as I can remember. And there was a lot of change with that. And I think that that's kind of what threw me. It wasn't just, the loss of having a relationship with that person. It was the loss of the part of identity that knew that person and interacted with them and spent time with them. And so I think the change element is also something we need to talk about more. This idea that we're supposed to stay the same and stay on track and not let ourselves be moved by the things that happen to us. I don't think is realistic, and I think it can be really harmful.
I like how you say that, we need to talk about these things and we need to have these conversations, because that's clearly a value for you. And that's backed up in this book. You talk to a lot of people, young people, experts, all kinds of people. You're doing a whole lot of the interviewing, which I love. I love that in a book. And it's not super common for me anyway to read a book that has done such extensive reporting and interviewing that also has such gorgeous prose. Like, you write really beautifully, even when you're not quoting someone. It's just really, really beautifully done. And I'm wondering, in all of those interviews, is there anyone that you can't get out of your head, who you met through the interview and now you're just like, I will never forget this person?
Oh my gosh, a bunch of people, actually. I think that the
Yeah.
great privilege of writing this book is getting to have, selfishly, my own life shaped by the people that I encounter. But there is an incredible person who I speak to actually in a couple different chapters, and I quote her in the introduction. Her name is Bree, and we were talking about adult milestones and what entry into adulthood looked like. And she made so many great points. The first one, was that for her, it was being able to make a decision by herself without consulting other people. It was having that sense of self-agency. But she also told me that she never pictured herself making it into adulthood. She never imagined herself in her early 20s, because she had grown up in a neighborhood that just did not pour resources into families and into young people, and they individualized what were very institutional failures. And I think that that will stay with me for the rest of my life, because we take growing up as a given, and it's not something, especially as we've seen over the past year, it's not something that everybody will definitely experience the same way, but even experience it all. And I feel like the way she captured that, I think that that will play on repeat every conversation I have with a young adult for the rest of my life.
Wow. In the book, as I read some of the accounts, some of the things that these young people told you about the circumstances of their lives, not just where they were in that moment, but also what they had come from in different situations, which could be great, which could be hard. I realized that we have this idea in this country that our main goal at any given time is to take care of children. It's children first. Children are most important. Our young people are most important. They are the future, right? Kids are the future. And then you start hearing from kids about what their lives are actually like, and you wonder, how does this gap exist? Like, why is the picture we have of ourselves and how we treat children, or how we think of children in this country. Why is that so different from the reality? So I kind of wanted to ask you, essentially, you know, we think, or we assert, that we're leaving one kind of legacy to young people in any given generation. What's the reality? What are we really leaving young people with?
Oh my God. Well, first of all, I feel like I've got to take this second to shout out your book, which handles the value and the richness and the complexity of childhood just impeccably. But I think that it's kind of this weird two-side thing we do. It's like we want to say we value children, but we really don't value childcare. We say we value young people and we value students, but I mean, how many students have you seen consulted on whether schools should reopen or how they should reopen? Usually it's not very many. And so I think that we do this very strange thing where the way we frame adulthood harms everybody. It pushes trajectories that benefit almost exclusively capitalism. It shames young people for feeling behind. It completely overlooks childhood because really we don't give very many kids opportunities to just be children. We've already got them kind of looking ahead and aspiring to the great young adults that they're going to be. And then we know that continues. It's the grades, it's the extracurriculars. It's, are you going to go to college? Where are you going to go? What are you going to major in? What are you going to do with the rest of your life? And on the flip side of that, it completely leaves out the young people that have had to step into adult roles way earlier than I think we like to imagine or even talk about. And so I don't think that we've done a great job in this country accepting that children and young people are actual human beings. They're not just a market or a group of students that we think that we can control and we know what's best for. They have rich inner lives, they have agency. And I think that the American narrative of ourselves as these great protectors of children, I think we've proven time and time again that that's not true. And I think that at least one, I think there are a lot of different policy solutions to that, in my opinion. I think a personal one is, when was the last time we really sat down and talked with a child or a young person about what they thought about things, about what they were experiencing? And I think it's not a matter of, well, we need to give the children a voice. They have a voice. We just need to get out of the way and listen to them.
I'm not going to say you right, but I'm going to point at the person who's preaching and telling the truth right now. That's what I'm going to do. In addition to talking to these young people, listening, you know, analyzing what you had, writing this book, you talked to a lot of experts, like a lot of experts. How did you describe to them what you were trying to do with this book when you reached out to them?
Oh, that's great. I'm sure somebody out there probably has like the really embarrassing initial emails I sent, where I'm sure I sound a little, unsure, because I mean, obviously I'd done reporting before, but this was the first time that I was reporting a book, obviously. And so I did try to approach it just the same way. I was basically like, my name's Rainesford. I'm writing this book. It's called An Ordinary Age, and it's about pressure to be exceptional and why that's happening to, people ages roughly 18 to 30. And then I do make it a point when I reach out to sources to tell them how I found their work and why I want to talk to them. And I think that was the coolest thing about that process was I got to sit and read so much different research that I don't think otherwise I ever would have been able to just sit with and kind of sift through. And so it was really interesting, kind of the responses, because I found that the enthusiastic responses were super enthusiastic. And then there were a couple that were like, well, the problem is that they're too sensitive. And I was like, okay, well, if you can tell me why you think that is, great. But if not, I think we're looking to have maybe different conversations.
Right. Definitely looking to have different conversations at that point.
Yeah.
As I was reading your book, as I was reading the accounts from these young people, these experts, even you on your personal experiences, which were so, like, I just felt you in so many different places. It's strange. We have different upbringings for sure. and circumstances of living, but there were so many points in the book where I was like, wow, these are just universal experiences. Like, we are just all feeling this way. I wanted to ask, what do young people have to look forward to in terms of like our ability to shift this phase for generations to come? Because, you know, I feel like in the book, you do a really good job of talking about the fact that this is a problem. You do a really good job of talking about like some of the ways that we can address this problem. But one of the things that I still walked away thinking about is, okay, so what do we do? Like, me as a person who's 34, you know what I mean? Just out of this phase, technically, you know, how do I start to support or set up encouragement in the places that would be most effective, making sure that like nobody has to go through what we went through, what we continue to go through in some cases?
Oh, I love this. I think, first of all, it's the whole idea of creating space. It's like, what do we
Mm,
allow to be acceptable? What do we allow to be permissible? Because, a
mm,
lot of people that I talked to felt like once they'd stumbled off this mythical path that we're all supposed to be on in adulthood, which strangely never acknowledges things like personal circumstance or finances, none of those things are factors. They felt
mhm,
like they were irredeemable. Like, this wasn't as simple as, oh, I dropped out of college and I lost my job and I'm having a hard time. This was, I'm fundamentally questioning my worth as a human being, because we live in a country that it prescribes value based on those things. We
right.
weigh people's worthiness. And so I think that one of the biggest things we can do is kind of a radical reimagining of what enoughness is in the context of our lives. And I think I think of that kind of from two perspectives. I think, first of all, we know that people, young people, but all people, do not have enough of the resources they need to live stable, happy, fulfilled lives. So I think that's the
Mhm,
policy side. And I don't think, while this is definitely not a policy book, I don't think that any conversation we have on young adulthood, or really lifespan just more generally, can go without that side. We live in a society that is systemically racist. We live in a society that makes things like a living wage and healthcare luxuries that we're supposed to earn. It's bizarre.
mhm,
There's no way anyone's going to feel fulfilled or supported if that's the baseline. I think the
mhm,
other side of enoughness is figuring out, who are we when the stuff that is supposed to hold our worth falls apart? And I think that what young people get told a lot is, you pick up the pieces, you move on to the next thing, you rebound. And I think that advice is really well intentioned most of the time, but I
mhm.
wonder what would happen if, in our conversations with young adults, which is where I think a lot of this has to happen, if we reframed it as, you know what, you're good enough even if you don't rebound, even if you don't do the next thing bigger or better or find your way or really prove the point to the people who doubted you. Like, you're good as you are. So maybe just sit with that for a second and move from there. I also think and hope, and this is something I heard from a lot of the people I spoke to, that sharing stuff on social media really does seem to help. People like to
Mhm.
hear other people's stories. They like to hear that they weren't the only one that was lost during this time of life or had what they felt like was a really big failure. And so I think that when we position being enough as you are as kind of the center point of the conversation, I'm hoping that it can reconfigure the supportive spaces that we all, I hope, want to create for young people and all people.
And one of the things working against that enoughness in your book also is a lot of chronic loneliness.
Oh,
People who feel not just alone in how they feel, but also physically alone. They feel like they don't have the kind of physical connection with a community that they would like to have. So, how do we begin relearning to live in real community with one another, do you think? Like, what would, if you had to think of just a first step in the right direction of thinking how to live that way,
Yeah.
where do we begin?
I think it's kind of a twofold first step. I think the first step, and this is really hard, but it's something that has changed my life almost beyond my comprehension, is we have to reach out to one another. And that's so hard. It's such a vulnerable place to reach out and say, hey, I want to be your friend. Or, hey, do you want to go get coffee in times that are normal? Do you want to talk to me about this? That's a scary thing to do because we're facing rejection and we all kind of know that. But I think that sometimes the focus is so much on, well, what if I'm socially shunned? What if this person says no? We forget that there's an equally likely scenario where the answer is a yes. And I think that that has fundamentally changed my life. And I'm very fortunate that I've had people that have done that to me when I wasn't the brave one. I wasn't the one reaching out. They gave me the easy answer to say yes. I also think we have to realize that we weren't supposed to go through any of this alone. I think that there's so much focus in general, but especially in young adulthood, on making sure our young people are self-reliant and they're individuals, and that's very important. But this hyper individualism kind of makes us think, well, if I had community and I deserved it, they would all just kind of magically find me. It would just be there. Or I'm a failure for not being able to navigate life by myself. Why can't I figure this out alone? And I think the short answer to that is we're not supposed to. That's kind of the missing piece.
Woo, I like that. I like that. In about 5-10 minutes, we're gonna move into Q&A. So I just want everybody to put your questions in now if you have them. I see that some people asked some questions earlier. It would be a huge favor to me if you could copy your question and put it in now so that I can see it when it comes up in the later part of the chat. I have a couple more questions for Rainesford and then we'll get to you. So one of the things that I think is at fault for just a ton of what's happening in the country that we see that we don't really like, that we're wondering why it's so hard to be on each other's side, why it's so hard to get it together and work together, is essentially because we have a lack of imagination about how we could connect and how we could be together. I think in some ways that imagination has been purposefully stunted. And I think in other ways, it's just unexplored because we don't have a lot of practice exploring it. So I would like you to join me in this practice for a second. And I want you to imagine what young adulthood could look like.
Cool.
So what do you think it could look like?
When I think of what it could look like, I think of two things. I think of the idea of fullness, and I think of the idea of exploration. And I know the second one makes me sound a little hypocritical because I spend a lot of time in this book talking about it doesn't all have to be about exploring all the time. You are allowed to just chill out. You're allowed to enjoy the moment you're in. But I think we need to kind of reframe exploration to be a little bit more internal. I don't think we give young adults very much space to use their own internal imagination about themselves and about their lives. I think that in a lot of instances, from the time kids are tiny, we've kind of predetermined their fate. We really like to silo people off, and you're going to be the one that does this, and this kid is going to be the one that does that. And we are very interested in keeping them on those trajectories, whether that's the school system, whether that's society as a whole, whether that's parents. There's a lot of factors there. But where is the space for young people to imagine what a fulfilled life looks like? And when I found myself trying to answer a version of a very similar question for myself, I was like, oh my God, things have gone terribly off base because I can think of these ideas of what it's supposed to look, but it took me a lot longer to figure out this is the stuff that would matter to me if everything else disappeared. If I wasn't beholden to a job to a career path, to a trajectory, to our healthcare system, this is the stuff that would remain. And so I would hope, using my imagination, I think that young adults would have the resources they need because they'd be better equipped to imagine what they could be outside of the system that tells them what they are.
I like that too. So what matters most to you these days?
Oh, that's a great question. What matters most to me these days is definitely people. And I know that that's kind of a cliche answer, but I can tell you that over the past year, especially between a bunch of stuff with book and work and health, it has been so clarifying that you cannot take the relationships you have with other human beings for granted. And so I've tried to prioritize making more of a conscious effort to reach out and be vulnerable and try and connect with other people. I think that another thing that's been on my mind a lot in terms of mattering is sense of home, which for me, I'm fortunate enough ties right into people. It's how do I not only reap the benefits of being in community and being held by people that inspire me or uplift me, but what am I doing to pay that forward and put it back into the community structures that I'm in? Because I really do think that when we take care of each other, we're more likely to feel taken care of ourselves. And I think that that caretaking has really been important to me recently.
Rainesford, you are as impressive live as you are on the page.
Thank you.
You've written a fantastic book. And thank you so much for answering my questions today, since I was first in line. And we're going to get to some other questions for you. Cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. The first question: how did writing this book change or affect the way you now live your life? Did you change how hard you are on yourself, a career trajectory, anything like that?
Oh my gosh. I think it opened my eyes to a lot. I think to go back to, our very beginning of our conversation, I think that the idea that, we're supposed to do things this certain way and we're supposed to behave this certain way during this time of life. I think that I knew that. I knew in my gut that something wasn't clicking about that, but something about talking to 100 people who in all different circumstances are fundamentally saying the same thing, I think totally changed how I thought about myself as a mess or a failure or someone who needed to be really careful that she got things right because she'd already gotten so many things wrong. I also think that this is probably a strange one. As I sit here having written a book, I never thought I'd get to do that. I never thought I'd get to talk to someone like you about it. So it's a lot of dreams, but it totally reconfigured my perception of a dream job. And I just don't have one anymore. I think that my dreams are about community and about people. And I hope that I'm lucky enough to keep finding that and keep getting to do that in writing. But I'm no longer aspiring to hitting certain things and kind of upholding them as the dream. I want to figure out how we can do that for more people and what my role in that can look like.
Second question. There are so many people who go through the turmoil of youth silently. What was the turning point in your life as a young person where you said, okay, I'm going to actually tell this story and show the reality of young people's journeys, or people who are often so visible, yet silenced and dismissed?
Oh, I think the turning point in really wanting to do that for me actually happened long before I realized that it had. I think that when I lost the friend that I mentioned earlier, and that person was no longer part of my life, I think it was kind of jarring and thinking, oh my God, what are we doing? What are you trying to do? Because that was someone that I thought would get a lot more time to live their life in a certain way than ultimately happened. And so I think that that was one pivot point. I think the other one was actually when I was doing reporting for different pieces and I was talking to people that happened to be young adults about all kinds of different things, and we'd start or end the conversation just kind of casually chatting after we'd done the interview, and everybody was saying a version of the same thing, which is, when am I going to be good enough? Do we think this is
Mhm.
ever going to feel like enough? And it was impacting mental health. It was impacting people's relationships with their families and their friends and work. It felt like it had staggeringly altered our sense of identity. And
Mhm.
so that to me was the moment of like, we need to look closer and talk to people who are having these feelings, because if it's somehow coincidentally everyone I've spoken to, that definitely means that, it's not just us.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence.
No.
I'm gonna go ahead and confirm that for you. Uh, how how the social changes of life during the COVID-19 pandemic reaffirm or challenge your thoughts about young adulthood?
Oh, I think that one thing that it has unfortunately confirmed is we are still very committed to the timelines of things. One of the things that has frustrated me the most in how we've talked about the pandemic in general has been the framing of behindness. Like,
Mhm.
students are behind in school, the young people are behind on moving out. And instead of thinking, oh my gosh, what do these people need? What resources should we be giving? What support is lacking? It's always, well, you guys, what are you doing? Why are you not performing as well as we're used to you performing? What's happening? And so I think that that unfortunately confirmed that we are still very married as a country to the idea that there is a certain pattern on which things need to happen. Some people get to be ahead, others get to be behind, and that's kind of the way it is. What has given me a lot of hope is that I think that young adults themselves are going to dramatically change that in kind of the aftermath of this year. And I don't think that that'll be a generational change. I don't think it's something that's going to stick to Gen Z. I think that these generations are going to be the ones that kind of pull the roots up of this idea that it has to look and go a certain way, because they've had it. They've
Mhm.
been Zooming dying family members while their boss or professor won't let them out of class or out of work. Like, you don't come back from that and all of a sudden keep going along with the status quo of whatever the thing is. So I think the biggest thing that it is ultimately going to shift is our idea of how we value being on track. I think
Mhm.
society will continue to push hard against that. And I think that young people will really push back.
Let's hope.
I know. Fingers crossed. Do it.
Are there any interviews or stories that you really loved that ended up on the cutting room floor?
Oh my gosh. Yes, one immediately comes to mind. I interviewed a college student who has probably since graduated. Um, she was a low income student from a very rural community and got into what would popularly be considered a very prestigious school, and went into that school with basically no support at all. Was all of a
Mhm.
sudden in social circles or academic circles with peers that they were just not positioned to navigate, and ended up really struggling with addiction that derailed what they had considered to be their opportunity to get out, to make something of their life. And it took a lot of work and a lot of disconnecting from that idea of prestigious academia and pulling these all-nighters and going to every social event and having a cool internship while they were having to work to put themselves through school.
Mm.
That story, it didn't make it into the book because honestly, I think that it deserved a much longer space. I think that there was no way to condense that and do it justice to what this person had experienced and what they were articulating. But if you didn't think that our collegiate system needed an overhaul before, I really feel like after hearing that, it's just so staggering the ways that this impacts people, not academically and in terms of career, but like their fundamental humanity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, just today, IBM and Merck have announced that they will no longer require college degrees for entry level jobs, as in, you can never go or drop out and still get a starter job if you have certain skills or experiences. This follows Bank of America and Google a few years ago. Do you think, in your experience and observations, this trend will continue? And have you met any people while writing for this book who are working professionals thriving without graduating or going to college?
Oh, well, first of all, yes, not everybody in the book that is quote unquote of traditional college age, even though we know traditional college age is not a thing either. Not everybody
Mhm.
went to college. Some people didn't go at all and pursued trades. Other people have, some years of college and decided to leave for whatever reason. I hope that what this is a trend of is two things. First of all, I hope it's a trend, again, to go back to the timelines, that we're going to start being more accepting that not everybody's path is going to look the same and that this is not going to be a one size fits all process. There is no reason that a student who leaves college their sophomore year should be discouraged from finishing that when they're 30 and they might really want to. I talked to somebody just a couple days ago that had decided to go back to school to finish their degree in their 30s, and all their friends kept asking them, well, what are you going to use that for? You already have a job. And they were like, because it's important to me, because I've decided that it's something that matters to me. That's why I'm going to go do it. So I hope that we're seeing more flexibility in what we consider a worthy credential or a worthy path. And I got to get the plug in that I hope this goes right into canceling student debt and making college affordable and accessible to everybody. Because while I think we definitely need to support options besides college, of course, I think we also need to make sure that everybody gets the choice of what they think will be best for them and when they think it will be best for them.
Do you know I had a years-long gap between starting college and getting my degree?
I did know that.
Yeah, I just got it in 2018. Had to finish.
I love it.
Yeah, I was like, I can afford it now.
Yeah. We act like that's
So
not a
I
factor at
finished
all.
it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. My best friend also is going back in the fall. Same age as me, one of my best friends is gonna finish his now. Last question. How would you define in words the meaning of ordinary age as opposed to exceptional?
I think exceptional is what we are supposed to want, what we are trained to chase. I think ordinary is what we are on our own. I think it's back to that idea of enoughness. And when I think of the word ordinary, I think of a question that kind of prompted the writing of the book in general, which is, what if this was all I got? What if there was no better version of me out there, no better job, no better whatever? And it was just this. Could I live with that? And how would I live with that? And I think that that was kind of the turning point in how I thought about ordinary versus this idea of our extraordinary aspirational best selves. And it's not a matter of not having dreams or not having goals for your life, but I do think it's a matter of centering that those things actually come from you. They come from your heart, your imagination, your gut, not the expectations that are external that somebody else is meeting. And in terms of an ordinary age, I think that goes back to what we were talking about with messiness. This is a hard time of life. It's one full of a lot of transitions. And so I think if we can normalize some of those things like feeling lost or feeling lonely as ordinary feelings, I think it'll give us more opportunity to kind of embrace our ordinary selves.
You know what? I got 2 more minutes. Hey, Maris, give me one more question. I just want to ask this question real quick, without pressure or expectation. What's next for you?
I hope that a lot of the same is what's next for me. I was very happy that I woke up on Wednesday, the day after the book came out, and I had stories to work on. I still feel very lucky every time I get to write a piece, I get to talk to people. I would love to write another book because I've learned that despite being very introverted, I love talking to people. I love hearing their stories. And so I hope that what's next for me is kind of just getting to do more of that, because I don't think I'll ever stop feeling lucky that that's a factor in my life and a thing I get to go do.
Thank you so much, Rainesford.
Thank you. Oh my gosh.
Thank you, Rainesford and Ashley, and to this wonderful audience. A reminder to please buy Rainesford's book if you haven't, and if you have, you still have to pre-order Ashley's book. So
You want to pre-order it if you haven't already. It is on my shelf. It's one of the best books I've ever read in my life.
And
Y'all need to quit.
It's true.
and thank you all. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Good night.
Bye.